They say the condemned are granted one final request before they meet their fate. Most ask for a meal, a priest, or a letter to be delivered. But Margot Sullivan asked for something no one expected, to see her horse one last time. The guards laughed. The warden refused. But when they finally relented, what walked into that prison yard wasn't just an animal, it was a witness. And what that horse did in those final moments didn't just save a woman's life, it exposed a truth so devastating that an entire town would never be the same. Before we get into what happened when Margot faced that horse, I need to ask you something. If you knew an animal could sense the truth better than any judge or jury, would you trust it with your life? Because that's exactly what happened here. And I want to know, do you believe animals can see things we can't? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll shake you, and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story begins in a place where justice wore a blindfold, and only a horse could tear it off. Now let me take you back to where it all started. The year was 1889, and the town of Bitter Springs, Wyoming, was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and your sins. It sat in a valley carved between two mountain ranges, isolated enough that the law moved slowly and gossip moved fast. The railroad hadn't reached it yet, neither had mercy. Margot Sullivan was 32 years old when they arrested her for the murder of her husband, Roland Sullivan. She was a woman who'd learned to survive in a world that didn't make room for women like her, women who spoke their minds, who could break a horse better than most men, who refused to lower their eyes when challenged. She had copper-red hair that she wore in a long braid down her back, hands scarred from years of working with leather and rope, and a gaze that could cut through steel. Roland had been a cattle broker, a man 20 years her senior, who'd courted her with promises of stability and respect. What he'd delivered instead was isolation and cruelty. He controlled every cent she earned from training horses, every friendship she tried to maintain, every breath she took outside his presence. The town knew. They always know. But knowing and caring are different things, especially when the man in question had money and influence. When Roland was found dead in their barn, a pitchfork buried in his chest, the town didn't ask questions. They already had their answer. Margot was covered in his blood, standing over the body, her face blank with shock. She'd been the one to run for help, screaming for the neighbors. She'd been the one who couldn't stop shaking as the sheriff led her away in irons. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecutor was a man named Silas Crow, who had political ambitions and saw Margot's case as his ticket to the territorial capital. He painted her as a cold-blooded killer who'd grown tired of her husband's authority. He called her unnatural, a woman who preferred horses to homemaking, who had no children, who'd been seen arguing with Roland in public just days before his death. Margot's defense was simple. She hadn't done it. She'd found Roland like that, already dead when she'd returned from exercising a client's mare, but she had no alibi for the exact time of death, no witnesses, no proof, just her word against the evidence. And in Bitter Springs, a woman's word weighed less than dust. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes, guilty. The judge sentenced her to hang. They gave her 2 weeks to make peace with God. She spent most of it in a cell that smelled of rust and despair, writing letters that no one would send, and staring at a square of sky through a barred window. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears changed nothing. But there was one thing Margot couldn't stop thinking about: her horse, a stallion named Copperfield, a magnificent sorrel with a blaze down his face and a temperament that had made him unsellable until Margot got her hands on him. She'd spent 2 years earning his trust, turning him from a dangerous animal into something remarkable. He'd been her sanctuary, the one living thing that saw her as she truly was. When the warden, a granite-faced man named Tobias Fletcher, came to ask if she had any final requests, Margot didn't hesitate. "I want to see my horse," she said, "just once, just to say goodbye." Fletcher stared at her like she'd asked for the moon. "A horse? Woman, you're about to meet your maker and you want to waste your last moments with an animal?" "He's not just an animal to me," Margot said quietly. "He's the only thing in this world that ever listened without judging. Please." Fletcher refused at first. "It was irregular," he said. "Unprecedented." But Margot didn't beg. She simply looked at him with those steady eyes and waited. And something in that gaze, perhaps the dignity of it, perhaps the quiet devastation, made him reconsider. "1 hour," he finally said. "The morning of the execution. That's all I can give you." Margot nodded. It was enough. What neither of them knew was that this single act of reluctant compassion would unravel everything. Because Copperfield wasn't just a horse. He was a witness to something the trial had never uncovered. And when he walked into that prison yard, he would bring the truth with him. The morning of the execution arrived with a sky the color of old bruises. Margot woke to the sound of the gallows being tested, the creak of the trapdoor, the snap of the rope. They were making sure everything worked properly, efficient, professional, as if they were preparing for a barn raising instead of a killing. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Roland's face, not as it had been in death, but as it had been in life. The way his jaw would tighten when she displeased him, the way his hand would move to his belt, the way he'd smile at her in public and whisper threats in private. But she also saw Copperfield, the way his ears would prick forward when she approached, the way he'd lower his head for her to scratch behind his jaw, the way he'd follow her around the paddock like a loyal dog, this 1,000-pound creature who'd chosen her. A guard brought her breakfast, cornmeal mush and weak coffee, but she couldn't touch it. Her stomach was a knot of dread and something else she couldn't name. Not quite hope, maybe defiance. At 9 o'clock, Fletcher appeared at her cell. "They brought your horse," he said, his voice gruff. "You've got your hour." They led her out into the prison yard, with her hands still shackled. A small crowd had gathered, guards, a few curious townspeople who'd heard about the unusual request, and the hangman himself, a traveled professional named Edgar Whitmore, who took pride in his work. They all wanted to see the spectacle of a condemned woman saying goodbye to an animal. But when Margot stepped into the sunlight and saw Copperfield standing there, held by two nervous, stable hands, everything else fell away. He looked magnificent. Someone had brushed his coat until it gleamed like a new penny. His muscles rippled beneath his skin as he shifted his weight, nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. But the moment he saw Margot, everything about him changed. His ears shot forward. He released a low, rumbling nicker, the sound he'd always made when she came to him in the mornings, and then he lunged. The stable hands lost their grip on the lead rope, stumbling backward as Copperfield surged toward Margot with alarming speed. Several guards reached for their weapons, convinced the animal was attacking. Someone shouted for them to shoot, but Margot held up her shackled hands. "Don't!" she said, her voice carrying across the yard with unexpected authority. "He won't hurt anyone." And he didn't. Copperfield came to a trembling stop just inches from her, his massive head lowering until his muzzle touched her shoulder. He breathed in her scent in great shuddering inhalations, then pressed his forehead against her chest. The big horse was shaking. Margot's composure finally cracked. She leaned into him, her chains rattling as she tried to put her arms around his neck. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his mane. "I'm so sorry, I won't be there anymore." The yard had gone completely silent. Even the most hardened guards found themselves looking away, uncomfortable with the raw intimacy of the moment. But then Copperfield did something unexpected. He pulled back from Margot and turned to face the crowd. His ears pinned flat against his skull, and he released a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. A scream, high and piercing, full of fury and anguish. "Easy, boy," one of the stable hands said nervously. "He's spooked." "We should..." But Copperfield wasn't spooked. He was searching. His head swung back and forth across the assembled faces, and his body language shifted into something predatory. His muscles coiled, his eyes rolled, showing white. And then he saw him. At the back of the crowd, trying to remain inconspicuous, stood a man in his mid-30s with sandy hair and a forgettable face. His name was Vincent Hale, and he was Roland Sullivan's former business partner. He testified at the trial, confirming that Roland and Margot had been having marital difficulties, that Roland had confided fears for his safety. The moment Copperfield's gaze locked onto Vincent, the horse exploded into action. He charged across the yard with terrifying speed, scattering the crowd like bowling pins. People screamed and dove for cover. Vincent turned to run, but he wasn't fast enough. Copperfield caught him within seconds, rearing up and boxing the air around the man with his front hooves, not striking him, but trapping him, preventing his escape. Vincent fell to his knees, arms over his head, sobbing. "Get it away from me! Someone shoot it!" But Fletcher held up his hand, stopping the guards from drawing their weapons. Something was happening here, something that didn't make sense but felt important. He looked at Margot, who stood frozen in the center of the yard, her face white with shock. "Why is your horse doing this?" Fletcher demanded. Margot's mind was racing. Copperfield had always been protective of her, but this was different. This was specific, targeted. And then, like a key turning in a lock, she understood. "He knows," she whispered. Then louder, "He knows." She turned to Fletcher, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Copperfield was in the barn that day, when Roland died. I'd put him in the back stall because I was expecting a client. He was there. He saw everything." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "You're saying your horse witnessed the murder?" "I'm saying my horse knows who the real killer is." Margot pointed at Vincent with her shackled hands. "And it's him!" The prison yard erupted into chaos. Vincent was screaming denials. Copperfield was still boxing him in with his hooves, and the crowd was shouting over each other, some demanding the horse be destroyed, others calling for Vincent to be questioned. Fletcher raised his voice above the din. "Everyone shut up!" The authority in his tone cut through the noise like a blade. "Someone get that horse under control without hurting it. And you," he pointed at two guards, "hold Vincent Hale right there. Nobody moves until I get some answers." Margot stepped forward, speaking to Copperfield in a low, steady voice. "Easy, Copper boy. Easy now. I've got him. You did good. Come here, sweetheart." The horse's ears flicked toward her voice. Slowly, reluctantly, he backed away from Vincent, though his attention never left the cowering man. When Margot reached his side, she pressed her forehead against his neck again, and the trembling in his muscles gradually subsided. Fletcher approached Vincent, who was still on his knees, his face slick with sweat. "Well, you got something to say?" "That animal is insane," Vincent shouted. "This is ridiculous. You can't take the word of a horse over—" "I'm not taking anyone's word yet," Fletcher interrupted. "But I'm a practical man, Mr. Hale, and I've seen a lot of animals in my time. Dogs that could sniff out contraband, horses that could sense a storm coming hours before it hit. Animals know things we don't. They see things we miss." He crossed his arms. "So I'm asking myself, why would a horse that's known for being gentle suddenly want to kill you specifically? I don't know. Maybe it's confused. Maybe it—" "Copperfield isn't confused," Margot said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "He's the smartest horse I've ever trained, and he was there that day, in the barn. I'd stabled him in the back because I was working with another horse in the front paddock, but he would have seen anyone who came in. He would have seen who killed Roland." A murmur ran through the crowd. Fletcher studied Margot's face, then Vincent's, weighing possibilities. "Here's what bothers me," Fletcher said slowly. "At your trial, Mr. Hale, you testified that you hadn't seen Roland the day he died, said you were in town, at the bank, and that you'd heard about the murder later that evening. That true?" Vincent's throat worked. "Yes, that's what I said. So if you weren't there, why would this horse react to you like you were?" "I don't know. Maybe it smells Roland on me. Maybe—" "Roland's been dead 2 weeks," Margot cut in, "and Copperfield knew Roland, lived with him for 2 years. He never acted like this around my husband, even when Roland was cruel to me. This is different. This is recognition." One of the guards spoke up, a younger man named Peter Ashford, who'd been present at the murder scene. "Warden, if I may, there was something odd about the crime scene. Something I mentioned to Sheriff Dockery, but he dismissed it." Fletcher turned to him. "Go on." "There were 2 sets of boot prints in the blood, sir. One set was Mrs. Sullivan's, smaller, worn heels. But there was another set, larger, men's working boots. The sheriff said they must have been Roland's own prints from when he stumbled or fought his attacker. But what? Peter hesitated, glancing at Vincent. But Roland was wearing his good boots that day, the ones he wore to town. They had a different tread pattern. I noticed because I have the same kind, bought them from the same cobbler. Those prints in the barn weren't from Roland's boots. The yard went very quiet. Fletcher's expression had gone cold and hard. Is that so? And did anyone think to measure those prints? Compare them to anyone else's boots? No, sir. Like I said, the sheriff had already made up his mind, Margot finished bitterly. He had his killer. Why look for evidence that might complicate things? Fletcher turned back to Vincent. Mr. Hale, I'm going to ask you once, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Were you in that barn the day Roland Sullivan died? Vincent's face had gone from flushed to pale. Sweat dripped from his chin. His eyes darted to the prison gates, calculating whether he could run, but guards now blocked every exit. He was trapped as thoroughly as he'd trapped Margot. I want a lawyer, he finally said. I'm not saying anything without... But Margot had stepped forward, her voice rising with sudden conviction. You were stealing from him, weren't you? From the business. Roland suspected it. He told me he was going to audit the books. He was going to confront you. Vincent's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. That's why you went to the barn that day, Margot continued, the pieces falling into place as she spoke. You followed him there. You argued, and when he wouldn't back down, when he threatened to ruin you, you grabbed the nearest weapon and... He was going to destroy me! Vincent exploded, his self-control finally shattering. Over a few missing dollars. I'd been skimming a little off the top, sure, but he acted like I'd murdered his mother. He said he'd have me arrested, that he'd make sure I never worked again, that everyone would know I was a thief. The crowd gasped. Fletcher held up a hand for silence. So you killed him? Vincent's face crumpled. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I just wanted to scare him, to make him listen. But he turned his back on me, called me pathetic, reached for his horse. He gestured toward Copperfield. That damn horse said he was riding into town right then to report me. So I grabbed the pitchfork. And he couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And then you heard me coming, Margot said softly. You heard me leading the client's mare back to the barn. So you ran out the back way, and you let me find him. You let me take the blame. Vincent looked at her with something like pleading in his eyes. They were going to hang you anyway. Everyone knew you hated him. I thought no one would question it. You thought wrong, Fletcher said grimly. He nodded to the guards. Take him. Lock him up. As the guards hauled Vincent away, his protests fading into the distance, the prison yard remained suspended in shocked silence. Margot stood beside Copperfield, her shackled hands resting against his warm neck, unable to fully process what had just happened. She wasn't going to die. The realization hit her in waves. First relief so intense it made her knees weak, then a crushing anger at everything she'd endured, then a strange numbness that felt like her soul had been wrung out and left to dry. Fletcher approached her slowly, his weathered face unreadable. Mrs. Sullivan, he said quietly, I believe I owe you an apology. Margot looked at him. An apology won't give me back the 2 weeks I spent in that cell, thinking I'd never see another sunrise. No, Fletcher agreed. It won't. Nothing will. But for what it's worth, I am sorry. We all are. Are you? Margot's voice was sharp. Or are you just sorry you almost hanged the wrong person? Because I was there for every day of that trial. Warden Fletcher. I watched those 12 men decide my fate without ever really looking at me. I listened to that prosecutor call me unnatural, unwomanly, dangerous, and I saw the jury nod along like it all made perfect sense. They wanted to believe I was guilty. It was easier than considering other possibilities. Fletcher had the grace to look uncomfortable. You're right, and I can't change that, but I can make sure Vincent Hale faces justice for what he did. And I can get those shackles off you right now. He gestured to a guard who hurried forward with keys. As the iron cuffs fell away from Margot's wrists, she rubbed at the raw, reddened skin beneath, feeling the ghost of their weight even though they were gone. Peter Ashford, the young guard who'd mentioned the boot prints, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, I should have pushed harder. When I saw those prints didn't match, I should have insisted the sheriff investigate. I'm sorry." Margot studied his face, earnest, genuinely remorseful. He couldn't have been more than 25. "You tried," she said finally. "That's more than most people did." Dr. Eleanor Whitcomb, the town physician who'd examined Roland's body, emerged from the crowd. She was a stern woman in her 50s who'd fought her own battles to practice medicine in a profession dominated by men. "Mrs. Sullivan, I examined those wounds, the angle of entry, the force required. I noted in my report that it seemed inconsistent with a woman of your build, but the prosecutor dismissed it as conjecture." "Because it didn't fit the story everyone wanted to hear," Margot said bitterly. "No," Dr. Whitcomb agreed. "It didn't. I should have fought harder to make them listen. Everyone should have done something different," Margot interrupted, her voice weary. "But they didn't, and I can't carry everyone's guilt along with my own." She turned back to Copperfield, who had remained remarkably calm throughout all of this, as if he understood that his job was done. She pressed her face against his neck, breathing in his familiar scent, hay and sweat and sun-warmed copper. "You saved me," she whispered to him. "You magnificent, impossible creature. You saved me." The horse nickered softly, his breath warm against her hair. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sullivan, there will need to be a formal inquiry. A new trial for Hale. You'll need to testify." "I know. And there's the matter of your property. Your husband's estate." "I don't want anything that was his," Margot said sharply. "The house can rot. The land can return to wilderness. I want nothing that carries his name or his memory. The law says you're entitled to—" "The law?" Margot laughed, and there was no humor in it. "The law was about to kill me for a crime I didn't commit. Forgive me if I don't put much stock in what the law says I'm entitled to." Fletcher nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but your horses, you had several in training, didn't you? And Copperfield here." "Copperfield is mine," Margot said firmly. "He's always been mine. Roland never touched him, never rode him, never wanted anything to do with him. The other horses, I'll need to return them to their owners, finish the jobs I was contracted for. You're planning to stay in Bitter Springs." Fletcher sounded surprised. Margot hadn't thought about it until that moment. Stay in the town that had condemned her. Face the people who'd been so eager to believe the worst. Return to the barn where Roland had died. But then she felt Copperfield's solid warmth beside her, and she thought about the clients who'd trusted her with their difficult horses, and the few friends who'd believed in her innocence, even when it seemed futile. And she realized something. "I'm not going to run," she said quietly. "Running would mean they won. Running would mean I'm ashamed. And I have nothing to be ashamed of." A voice spoke from the crowd. Amelia Thorne, who owned the general store and who'd visited Margot in jail despite the social censure it earned her. "There are people here who never believed you were guilty, Margot. Not everyone in this town is blind or cruel." "I know," Margot said, meeting her eyes, "and I'm grateful for that." But even as she spoke, she could see others in the crowd. People who'd called for her death, who'd cheered when the sentence was pronounced, who'd probably been planning to attend the hanging like it was a social event. Some of them had the decency to look ashamed now. Others just looked confused, as if they couldn't quite understand how the narrative had shifted so dramatically. Edgar Whitmore, the hangman, approached with his hat in his hands. He was a tall, gaunt man who traveled from town to town, offering his specialized services to territorial justice systems. "Ma'am, I've been doing this work for 15 years. This is the first time I've ever been grateful not to spring the trap, for what it's worth." Margot looked at the man who would have killed her. "Do you ever think about them? The people you've hanged?" "Every one of them," Whitmore said quietly. "I keep a book. Names, dates, last words. I tell myself I'm just doing a job, that I'm not the one who judged them guilty, but I think about them. Always." "You would have thought about me too," Margot said, "and you would have been thinking about an innocent woman." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Yes, ma'am, I would have. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting away in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they discussed what they'd just witnessed. Margot heard fragments of conversation, shock, indignation, a few defensive justifications, but she couldn't bring herself to care what they were saying. Fletcher organized for someone to bring water for Copperfield and offered to have a wagon take Margot wherever she wanted to go. But she declined both. She'd walked into this prison, believing she'd never walk out alive. She wanted to leave on her own terms, with her own horse, under her own power. At least let me send someone with you, Fletcher insisted. For protection, if nothing else. There may be people who aren't happy about this turn of events. Margot thought about Vincent's family. He had a wife, Constance, and 2 young children. Would they blame Margot for his arrest? Would they see her as the reason their lives were being destroyed, ignoring the fact that Vincent had destroyed his own life the moment he'd chosen murder? I can handle myself, Margot said. But then she saw the genuine concern in Fletcher's face and relented slightly. But if you want to send someone to make sure I get home safely, I won't argue. Peter Ashford volunteered immediately. He'd already proven himself more thoughtful than most, and Margot appreciated that he didn't try to make small talk as they prepared to leave. Dr. Whitcomb approached once more before they departed. Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to examine you before you go. Make sure you're physically well enough to travel. I'm fine. You've been in a prison cell for 2 weeks, eating prison food, under enormous psychological strain, and you were hours away from execution. Let me do my job. Margot allowed herself to be led to a small room off the prison yard. Dr. Whitcomb checked her pulse, her eyes, listened to her heart and lungs. She examined the marks the shackles had left on Margot's wrists with a disapproving frown. You're dehydrated, she pronounced. Malnourished, exhausted. You should rest for at least a day before attempting any strenuous activity. I just want to go home. Home to that barn? Home to where your husband died? Dr. Whitcomb's voice was gentle but firm. Margot, you need to give yourself time to process what's happened. All of it. I've had 2 weeks in a cell to process, Margot said. 2 weeks to think about nothing but death and injustice and everything I'd lost. I don't need more time sitting still. I need to move. I need to be with my horse. I need to feel like my life belongs to me again. Dr. Whitcomb regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. I understand, but promise me you'll eat something. Real food and sleep. And if you start feeling overwhelmed, I've been overwhelmed since the moment they arrested me. Margot interrupted softly. I've learned to function while overwhelmed. I'll manage. The doctor sighed and pulled something from her medical bag. A small bottle of tonic. For sleeping. Just a few drops in water before bed. It'll help quiet the mind. Margot accepted it, though she doubted she'd use it. She'd spent 2 weeks lying awake in a cell. What difference would a few more sleepless nights make? When she emerged back into the prison yard, she found Amelia Thorne waiting with a basket. Food, she said simply. Bread, cheese, some of that dried beef you always liked. And I packed feed for Copperfield too. Margot felt her throat tighten. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to. I wanted to. Amelia reached out and squeezed Margot's hand. We're not all cowards in this town, Margot. Some of us knew, and those of us who knew are going to make sure people remember what almost happened here. It won't change anything, Margot said. Vincent will be tried and hanged, and everyone will tell themselves that justice was served in the end. They'll forget that they almost murdered me. Maybe some will, Amelia admitted, but not everyone. There are people in this town who are going to look at themselves in the mirror tonight and not like what they see. That's the beginning of change. Peter brought Copperfield over, the horse's lead rope in hand. The stallion immediately moved to Margot's side, pressing close to her, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. He really loves you, Peter observed. I've worked around horses my whole life, and I've never seen one react to a person the way he reacts to you. The feeling's mutual, Margot said, running her hand down Copperfield's neck. He's been my anchor through everything. My reason to keep going even when Roland made life unbearable. I used to tell myself that I couldn't give up because Copperfield needed me, but it turns out I needed him more. She mounted from the ground, an impressive feat that drew appreciative murmurs from the remaining onlookers, and settled into the familiar comfort of Copperfield's broad back. Peter mounted his own horse, and together they rode out of the prison yard. The town of Bitter Springs spread before them, its main street dusty and familiar. People stopped to stare as they passed. Some called out tentative greetings or congratulations. Others simply watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Margot kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show any weakness or uncertainty. She was done being Bitter Springs' victim. She was done being anyone's victim. When they reached the turnoff to her property, Peter hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure you want to go back there? Tonight? You could stay in town at the boarding house just until—" "I appreciate the concern, Peter, but I need to go home. I need to sleep in my own bed. I need to start reclaiming my life." He nodded, understanding even if he didn't fully agree. "I'll ride the perimeter then, make sure everything's secure before I head back." True to his word, Peter checked the barn, the house, the fences. Everything was as Margot had left it, though covered in 2 weeks' worth of dust and neglect. Roland's blood still stained the barn floor, a dark reminder that Margot knew she'd have to deal with eventually. But not tonight. Tonight, she settled Copperfield in his stall with fresh hay and water, murmuring thanks and praise while he ate. Tonight, she walked into her house now, not Roland's, and locked the door behind her. Tonight, she sat at her kitchen table and ate Amelia's bread and cheese, and allowed herself finally to cry. The tears came in waves, great shuddering sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in Margot's chest. She cried for the terror of the past 2 weeks, for the life she'd lost with Roland, for the years she'd spent trying to make herself small enough to fit into his idea of what a wife should be. She cried for the town that had condemned her without real evidence, for the system that had valued a man's reputation over a woman's life, for the bitter understanding that if not for Copperfield's unexpected intervention, she would be dead now. The sobs eventually subsided into hiccups, then silence. Margot sat in her kitchen as darkness fell, too exhausted to light a lamp, too raw to move. Outside, she could hear Copperfield shifting in his stall, the comforting sounds of his presence. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring complications. Vincent's trial, questions about the estate, the slow, painful work of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. But tomorrow was not tonight. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Margot's first instinct was fear. Who would come here after dark? But then she heard Amelia's voice. "Margot, it's me. I saw Peter ride back into town without you, and I wanted to make sure you were all right." Margot opened the door to find Amelia holding a lantern, her face creased with concern. Behind her stood 2 other women, Josephine Carter, who trained horses on the neighboring property, and Ruth Montgomery, a widow who ran a small ranch on her own. "We're not staying," Amelia said quickly. "We just wanted you to know you're not alone, that there are people who stand with you." Josephine stepped forward, pressing a folded piece of paper into Margot's hand. 17 women in this town signed this. It's a testimony of character. About you, about your skills with horses, about how we've all seen Roland treat you over the years. We're taking it to the territorial judge. We're making sure they know that some of us never believed you were guilty. Margot unfolded the paper with trembling hands. There, in careful script, were names and statements. Women she knew, women she'd worked with, women who'd had the courage to speak up, even when it might cost them socially. "Why didn't you bring this to the trial?" Margot asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ruth's expression hardened. "We tried. Prosecutor Crow refused to admit it as evidence. Said character witnesses were irrelevant in the face of physical evidence. Judge Carmichael agreed. But they were wrong," Josephine added fiercely. "And we're going to make sure everyone knows they were wrong. We're going to make sure this town remembers what they almost did, what they were willing to do." Amelia set the lantern down on Margot's porch. "We're also going to make sure Vincent Hale's trial is different. We're going to attend every day. We're going to make our presence known. We're going to ensure that justice is actually served this time." Margot looked at these three women, each of them strong in their own way, each of them familiar with the particular challenges of being female in a world designed for men. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what else to say except thank you." "You don't need to say anything," Ruth replied. "Just keep being who you are. Keep training horses. Keep refusing to apologize for being competent and independent. That's the best response to everything that's happened." After they left, Margot sat on her porch with the lantern, reading through the testimonies. Each one was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to accept the narrative that had been forced upon her. Women who'd watched her work with difficult horses and seen her patience, her skill, her dedication. Women who'd noticed the bruises Margot tried to hide, who'd heard the cruel comments Roland made in public and imagined what he said in private. Women who'd understood that a victim of violence could become a suspect for that same violence with terrifying ease. The next morning, Margot woke early, her body still on prison rhythms, and went immediately to check on Copperfield. He greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, and she spent a long time just standing in his stall, her forehead pressed against his neck, drawing strength from his solid warmth. "You did something incredible," she told him. "You saw through all the lies and complexity and human nonsense, and you just knew. How did you know, Copper Boy? How did you know to react that way to Vincent?" Copperfield, of course, didn't answer. He just huffed softly and nudged her shoulder, looking for the apple she usually brought him in the mornings. "I don't have one today," Margot said apologetically, "but I'll get you one. I promise." She was halfway to the house when she saw the rider approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat. Would she ever stop feeling that spike of fear when someone unexpected appeared? But then she recognized the horse, Peter Ashford. He dismounted quickly when he reached the yard. "Mrs. Sullivan, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but there's been a development. Vincent Hale attempted to take his own life last night. He's alive, but barely. And before they stopped him, he wrote a full confession." Margot's legs felt suddenly weak. "A confession?" Peter pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Warden Fletcher thought you should see it. He details everything, the embezzlement, the confrontation with Roland, the murder itself. He describes how he heard you coming and fled through the back of the barn, how he circled around and joined the crowd of neighbors who came when you screamed for help, how he watched you get arrested and said nothing." Margot took the confession with numb fingers. Vincent's handwriting was shaky but legible. She read through it once, then again, her eyes catching on certain phrases. "I told myself she deserved it, that she'd made Roland's life miserable, that she was probably glad he was dead anyway. I convinced myself I was doing the world a favor, removing a woman who didn't know her place, but the truth is, I was a coward. I killed a man over money and pride, and then I let an innocent woman take the blame, because it was easier than facing what I'd done. I cannot live with this guilt. I cannot face my wife and children knowing what I am. I cannot look at myself in the mirror anymore." Margot Sullivan was innocent. She was always innocent, and I hope she can find some peace knowing that the truth has finally come to light. Margot's hands were shaking by the time she finished reading. This was vindication, yes. But it was also confirmation of her darkest suspicions, that Vincent had knowingly, deliberately allowed her to be condemned, that he'd watched her trial and said nothing, that he would have watched her hang and said nothing. "They're saying he'll survive," Peter continued quietly, "but his confession will be admitted as evidence at his trial. With that and what happened yesterday with your horse, there's no question about his guilt." "Good," Margot said, and meant it. She handed the confession back to Peter. "Make sure everyone sees this. Make sure everyone in Bitter Springs reads what he wrote. I want them to understand exactly what almost happened." Vincent Hale's trial began 3 weeks later, and it was nothing like Margot's had been. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, with people who'd heard about the horse that had identified a killer, about the confession written in desperation, about the woman who'd nearly been executed for a crime she didn't commit. Margot sat in the front row, Amelia on one side and Josephine on the other. She wore her best dress, simple but well made, and kept her head high despite the stares and whispers. Let them look. Let them see the woman they'd condemned, alive and present and unbroken. The trial lasted 4 days. Prosecutor Crowe, humiliated by his error in Margot's case, had recused himself. The new prosecutor was a woman named Catherine Brennan, brought in from the territorial capital specifically for this case. She was methodical and merciless, building a case against Vincent that left no room for doubt. She presented Vincent's confession. She called Dr. Whitcomb to testify about the wounds and the angle of attack. She brought in Peter Ashford to discuss the boot prints that had been ignored during Margot's investigation. She even called Fletcher to describe what had happened in the prison yard when Copperfield had confronted Vincent. The defense tried to argue that the confession had been written under duress, that Vincent had been suicidal and not in his right mind. But the physical evidence supported every detail of his account. The boot prints matched Vincent's work boots. The timing aligned with his known movements that day, and there was the undeniable fact that he'd broken down and confessed when confronted by a horse that had witnessed the crime. Margot was called to testify on the 3rd day. She described finding Roland's body, her arrest, her trial, the 2 weeks she'd spent awaiting execution. Her voice remained steady throughout, though her hands gripped the rail of the witness box hard enough to turn her knuckles white. "And when your horse reacted to Vincent Hale," Catherine asked, "what did you feel?" Margot took a breath. At first, confusion, then understanding. Copperfield had been in that barn. He'd seen what happened, and he remembered. Animals don't lie. They don't have ulterior motives. They just react to what they know to be true. "Do you believe your horse saved your life?" "I know he did. If Vincent hadn't confessed, I'd still be dead. Copperfield gave me the time I needed for the truth to come out." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Vincent would hang for Roland's murder. When the verdict was read, Margot felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a hollow kind of relief. It was over. Finally over. Constance Hale approached her outside the courthouse, her face ravaged by tears. Her children weren't with her. Someone had wisely kept them away from this. "I'm sorry," Constance said brokenly. "I'm so sorry for what he did to you, for what he put you through." Margot looked at this woman whose life had been destroyed by her husband's choices and felt an unexpected kinship. "It's not your fault. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. I should have. There were signs. The money he'd been spending, the way he acted after Roland died. I should have questioned it. We both married men who weren't what they seemed," Margot said quietly. "We both paid for their sins. But we're still here. We survived them." Constance nodded, wiping her eyes. "What will you do now?" "Live," Margot said simply. "Train horses, rebuild my reputation, prove that I'm more than this tragedy." "And me?" Margot hesitated, then reached out and squeezed Constance's hand. "The same. You're not defined by what your husband did. Neither are your children. Don't let this destroy you." 3 years passed. Margot Sullivan became something of a legend in Wyoming territory. The woman who'd been saved by her horse. The woman who'd survived both an abusive marriage and a wrongful conviction. The woman who'd refused to let injustice break her. Her horse training business flourished. People came from 3 territories over to have her work with their difficult animals. She had a gift, they said, an understanding of horses that went beyond technique into something almost mystical. She never remarried. The thought of binding herself to another person, legally and socially, held no appeal. But she wasn't alone. Josephine became a close friend and frequent collaborator. Amelia remained a steadfast supporter. Ruth taught her how to manage her finances and business contracts, ensuring she'd never again be dependent on anyone. The barn where Roland had died was torn down. Margot built a new one, larger and better designed, with Copperfield's stall positioned so he could always see her working in the training paddock. The stallion himself aged gracefully, his copper coat acquiring a few white hairs around his muzzle. his movements perhaps slightly slower but no less powerful. Margot never bred him, never sold him, never considered parting with him. He had saved her life. She would honor that gift by ensuring he lived out his days in comfort and love. Vincent Hale was hanged on a cold November morning. Margot didn't attend. She had no desire to watch another human being die, regardless of what he'd done. But she heard about it. How he'd gone to the gallows with dignity, how he'd asked forgiveness from Margot publicly in his last words, how he'd expressed hope that his death might serve as some small recompense for the injustice she'd suffered. Margot didn't forgive him. Perhaps someday she would, but not yet. The trauma of those 2 weeks in a cell, waiting to die, had left marks that would never fully fade. But she did acknowledge that his confession had freed her, that his final act of honesty, however motivated by guilt and despair, had given her back her life. The town of Bitter Springs changed too, though slowly. The trial had forced uncomfortable conversations about justice, about gender, about the ease with which people believed the worst of those who didn't conform to expectations. Some people learned from it, others didn't. Judge Carmichael quietly retired. Prosecutor Crow left Wyoming entirely, his reputation damaged beyond repair. Fletcher remained as warden, but instituted new protocols for reviewing evidence in capital cases. And the story of Copperfield, the horse who'd identified a killer, spread far beyond Bitter Springs. Newspapers across the territory picked it up. Some versions were sensationalized, claiming the horse had somehow communicated in human language or performed impossible feats. But the truth was remarkable enough on its own. Margot gave one interview to a journalist named Isabella Frost, who promised to tell the story accurately. The resulting article ran in newspapers across the West, and the responses Margot received ranged from supportive to skeptical to outright hostile. But she read every letter, and to the ones from women who'd experienced similar injustices, who'd been blamed, condemned, or disbelieved, she wrote back. On the 3-year anniversary of the day she'd been scheduled to hang, Margot rode Copperfield out to a meadow she'd discovered in the mountains above Bitter Springs. It was early autumn, the aspens turning gold, the air crisp with approaching winter. She dismounted and let Copperfield graze while she sat on a sun-warmed rock, looking out over the valley. From this distance, Bitter Springs looked peaceful, almost beautiful. Copperfield wandered over eventually, resting his head on her shoulder in the companionable way he'd developed over their years together. Margot reached up and scratched behind his ears. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know I've said it before, but thank you for seeing the truth, for refusing to let it stay hidden, for saving me." The horse huffed against her neck, his breath warm and steady. "I've been thinking," Margot continued, speaking more to herself than to him, "about what we're owed in this life. I used to think I was owed fairness, justice, a chance to be seen and valued for who I actually am. But I've learned that the world doesn't owe us anything. What we get, we have to fight for. We have to demand it. We have to refuse to accept less." She stood, pressing her forehead against Copperfield's for a long moment. "So that's what I'm going to keep doing. Fighting, demanding, refusing, and training horses because it turns out I'm really good at that." Copperfield nickered his approval. Together they rode back down the mountain as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected ways. A horse's memory, a confession born of guilt, a town forced to confront its own willingness to believe the worst. Margot Sullivan's story could have ended on a gallows, another woman erased by a system that valued convenience over truth. But it didn't, because one animal refused to forget what he'd witnessed, and one woman refused to give up hope even in her darkest hour. There are no true villains in this story, not really. Vincent Hale was a man who made terrible choices out of fear and selfishness. The jury that convicted Margot was operating on the limited evidence presented to them and the prejudices of their time. Even Roland, for all his cruelty, was a product of a world that taught men they owned their wives. But there are heroes: Margot, who survived and rebuilt; Copperfield, who remembered and revealed; the women who stood by her when it was socially dangerous to do so; The young guard who noticed what others ignored. The warden who allowed an unusual request that changed everything. History is full of injustices narrowly averted, lives saved by chance or fate, or the stubborn refusal of truth to stay buried. Margot's story is one of them. And while she never sought to become a symbol or a legend, that's precisely what she became. A reminder that innocence doesn't always protect you, but courage and a loyal horse just might. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where injustice still happens, where people are judged before being heard, where the vulnerable are assumed guilty, remember Margot, remember Copperfield, remember that truth has a way of fighting back even when all seems lost, and maybe, just maybe, give a little extra love to the animals in your life. They see more than we know.